of OTC derivatives and liquidity regulations and so on, and the remunerations, how to discipline remunerations of banks. It is a part of the statement of heads of states, and it's very peculiar, but still it was needed. So we have addressed the issues of the capital ratio, liquidity regulation, how to use rating agencies, and once again, the pay of banks, and so on. It is still ongoing, but we have agreed to the Basel III capital requirement. So we have made a lot of progress. What I'd like to say at this moment is the importance of course, regulations is important. But at the same time, regulations, especially rules, is not the panacea. Like there is no panacea to the euro problem or problem of Japanese fiscal conditions. There is no panacea to the banking sector issues. The rules, very strict rules, alone cannot solve the issue. Because once again, for crisis, there is a macroeconomic reason, bias. I want to emphasize that after the demise of a Bretton Woods system, which was the fixed exchange rate system with a very strong regulations of the financial sector, and also the control of capital. Until 1970s, when we aborted the fixed exchange rate system, the IMF asked countries to take stronger capital control measures to avoid the crisis of currencies, and also the interest rates and the commissions of bond trading. All of them were controlled by governments in advanced economies. But it was changed after we decided to dismiss the fixed exchange rate. The reason we gave up a fixed exchange rate was not by intention. We couldn't continue to support it. Once we decided to give up the idea of having a fixed exchange rate, we started promoting the free flow of capital between countries, and then we decided to liberalize financial market based on the idea that free flow of money between countries and between the industries within the country is the best way to allocate the money to the most productive places. But still, because of that, there have been a lot of bubble and bust. In case of Japan's bubble and bust, there are commonalities, there are common elements in the bubble and bust. That is, there is a certain change in system, and then there is a very serious euphoria in the economy and excessive financial activities. And in case of Japan, the change of system was we liberalized banking sector and the security market so much in 1980s, and because of that, companies started issuing bond, and banks had difficulty finding places to lend money, so they invested heavily in real estate market. In case of Asian crisis, the reason was they liberalized the inflow of capital, especially regarding the short-term capital. And in case of the United States, I would say the abandonment of Glass-Steagall and other financial innovation was in the background of the excessive, financial activities. And in case of euro, the introduction of euro itself brought about a lot of ideas about euphoria and excessive financial activity. So there is a certain reason, and of course, we should try to avoid it, but I think it can sometimes happen. So we must be very careful about monetary policies and other macro policies to avoid bubble. Once the bubble is burst, it's very difficult to take care of balance sheet issues as the US faces and the European countries now face. Japan has been very much humiliated after the burst of the crisis. by saying that Japan does too late and too small, and we were humiliated as if we don't know anything about macroeconomic policies. But Dr. Krugman recently mentions apology to our emperor. Why emperor? I don't know. Why not the governor of a central bank? Maybe for finance ministers, there have been too many finance ministers, so he cannot find one. But anyway, but what I want to say is it's very difficult to manage macroeconomic policies, and it's very difficult to have a very good, striking a good balance of regulation. And regarding, I'm sorry to speak too much about these issues, but it's really important to have a good coordination between regulators and Ministry of Finance and the central banks. The previous idea before this crisis was they should be more and more independent, and they should have a clear target, and they should stick to it. But I would say central banks should take care of course, stability of prices, but they also should look at the market condition, stability of the financial system. They should look at the liquidity conditions of each bank, and that's what the BOJ is doing. So regulators should exchange views about these issues with the central banks. And also, the Ministry of Finance should be involved in this kind of discussion, because macroeconomic condition is so linked to the financial soundness. So if Ministry of Finance is too strong, it might invite postponing the taking care of difficult institutions, and also it might cause the easy monetary condition because fiscal situation can be better by easy monetary conditions. So there is a clearly conflict of interest. But at the same time, we need a strong coordination between those three agencies. Otherwise, if regulators just look at the individual institutions' health based on the micro-prudential idea, it might cause in total the huge deleverage, which can cause a macroeconomic problem, which then would invite a more serious financial problem. So that's what I would like to emphasize as a lesson from this crisis. Today, there are a lot of, again, efforts to address the problem of financial regulations, how to strengthen it. But we should be careful about fragmentation of markets because of a fragmentation of regulations. Many people say that it is happening in Europe. And also, of course, we must worry about the regulatory arbitrage, but also we must be worried about miscoordination between countries, or the duplication of regulations. Japanese financial industry and the FSA are so much concerned about some elements of Dodd-Frank regulations, and also OTC derivative regulations, which are included in the Dodd-Frank because of extraterritorial application to institutions in Japan, for instance, and it damages the liquidity of transactions of a government bond of Japan. The US Treasury bill is exempted, but the Japanese bonds are not. And also it affects currency swap dealing. So, and also we are worried about initial margin regulations of OTC derivative. So miscoordination between countries must be taken care. Finally, I'd like to mention again that financial regulation, good financial regulation rules are important, but it alone cannot prevent the crisis. And if we have a very narrow-minded strengthening of regulation, it might cause problems. So we need a good balance of good macroeconomic management and good regulations, good rules, and also good supervision by sensible regulators. Because it's very important to find problems of institutions by good communication between authorities and banks. And Also, finally, I think in the end, we need common sense and morale by financial industries managers. Japanese banks, which have a history of 300 years, have a kind of a principle that is, they shouldn't pursue the floating benefit, which is the bubble type benefit. The financial transactions should be based on the real activity of the country. Of course, it has very important functions of finding opportunities for the future, finding the venture business and so on. I think, I believe that the financial liberalization has promoted higher growth of emerging economies and higher growth in many countries. So I really respect the function of financial industry, but at the same time, it should be clearly based on the real benefit of the society instead of just taking the benefit from other people. So I'll conclude my remark. Thank you.
Well, there's a lot of food for thought there. We have several plates full. And I'm sure this has ignited some good questioning from you all. We got 3 hands there. We'll take in the last row first. And if you could just your name and association, affiliation, and go ahead.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Philip Imran from the Guardian newspaper. It was a question to the panel that relates to the first speaker, who seemed to be saying that life was becoming too complex to regulate, and whether simplification of the financial system was as much necessary as chasing it around the globe, chasing the money and trying to regulate it that way.
Good. We'll have gather a few questions before asking our panel to respond to it. And over here. Those who have questions, I'd recommend you make your way to the mic and you'll be recognized at the mic just to save time. Thank you.
Thank you. Jo Marie Griesgraber, New Rules for Global Finance. I was rather startled at what I perceived as the attitude, if you will, or the position of the person from the private market, because it seemed as though speed and innovation were not only necessary but positive, and that the high cost of regulation were just dastardly. And yet, what is the calculation of the cost to the real economy and to real people's employment? I mean, how do you calculate that? And it seemed to be absent from the consideration. And I would like to suggest that the closing remark of the gentleman from the Finance Ministry of Japan, where you test the real benefit to the real economy of the financial system or the financial industry, as well as the comment of the earlier panel where the market must wait for democracy. I think that we have some priorities over the fastest profit possible for leaders in the financial industry.
I'd appreciate it if you could end up with a question that the panel can respond to. Please.
Thank you very much. My name is Adelheid Bürger-Schmelz. I am a director and department head at the IMF. This is a question on shadow banking or non-banks, for that matter. We live in an interconnected world that goes beyond national boundaries. National implementation of the G20 and FSB efforts to reduce systemic risk is certainly necessary, but in all likelihood, it might not be sufficient. What is the panel's views about acting on systemic risks at a global level, and how do you see a way to share information on those risks? Thank you.
Jean-Paul, are you at the mic? Thank you.
First of all, I would say that the part on non-banks in particular was particularly striking. But I would like to ask the panel whether they have views to share with us on the liquidity ratio and all that part of what has been decided already but not yet implemented, and whether or not we are there with the perspective of having some possible amendments to the concepts that had been envisaged. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's enough to begin with, if not to end with. Adair, you look prepared.
Okay, well, on the first question from Philip Inman of the Guardian, is the thing too complex to regulate? Do we need to simplify it? I think we should have a strong tendency to try and put into regulation some things which help us simplify it. And I think, for instance, strong capital requirements are part of that. I would say that one of the things we've tried to do in the past is to make up for light capital requirements by supervising like mad. I mean, the lighter your capital requirements, the less shock absorbers you've got, and the more that you've got to dive into the details of supervising. The higher we have the capital requirements, the more that the supervisors can be a little bit distant and say, well, there's enough capital in there to deal with the imperfections of risk management techniques. And I think there is a bit of a trade-off between some of these rules and the intensity of supervision, which we could think about a bit more. But your question was much more, I think, about the structural things that we do. And I do think the ideas which have come out of the Vickers Commission and the Liikanen Commission, that there is a value in structural separation between, for instance, ring-fenced retail banks and banks outside that. Those are valuable because I think it's very difficult for us to end up with real resolvability when we have very, very complex banks which are doing multiple activities in multiple different legal forms. I think separating the legal forms by function and having a vision of how we would resolve and how we do capital and liquidity separately against those, which is the fundamental concept of both Vickers and Liikanen, I think is an important way forward to make this more manageable. I think I'll skip on the other two. No, can I make a brief comment on shadow banking and then a comment on Jean-Claude on liquidity? On shadow banking and activities and international, I think it's a very important a question about, once we're clear what we want to do in the regulation of shadow banking, how will we actually do it? And it is a big challenge, because we have developed over the years a way of regulating and actually agreeing international rules on banks. And we've been at it now for 30 years, and we've got the Basel Committee, and we know how to do it. And we have the ability to say the ratio shall be 7%, and we've got some mechanisms to do it. When you go over to shadow banks, you're not dealing with a specific set of institutions. You're dealing with a complex set of market relationships and market activities. And actually, we don't have the same robust infrastructure of global prudential regulation in that area, because a lot of this falls within the area of securities regulators, who have tended to come out of conduct supervision space rather than prudential supervision space, and we just don't have the same established mechanisms of agreeing to international standards. So I think it will take us time to go in that direction, and it's one of the major challenges we've defined over the next year within the FSB is, now that we've got a better vision of what we want to do on shadow banking, how are we actually going to achieve implementation? Finally, Jean-Claude, on the liquidity ratio. I mean, I think the basic concept of the liquidity coverage ratio is right. I think we are pretty close to an agreement on the denominator, I think, is clear. I think debates have now broken out about the numerator, about what should count. And let's be clear, one of the things that has happened there is we defined that the best form of liquid asset buffer, the undoubted risk-free liquid asset, was either central bank reserves, and we still feel pretty good about that, or was sovereign bonds. And we got round to defining that and agreeing on a quantitative global standard for that just at the point where we began to say, ooh, Are all sovereign bonds equally risk-free? And we know we have a problem with this, and we know we have a problem within the Eurozone. I mean, what I would say is we can't, as it were,